Let's talk about security. So, I've been talking about this a bit. I've had some conversations about this over the last couple of weeks, last couple of days, really, I should say. And oh yeah, that's not actually something to do. In France, they have this thing, and I mean, it's a joke, but I presume that it's true, that French labour laws contain more words than the entire Bible. They have very stringent labour laws that they have built up over time. And President Macron is very interested in changing these. In fact, he passed some reforms using presidential and cabinet powers outside of parliamentary process last year to...
He used the parliamentary process. Pretty sure he used.
Okay, well, I read a news article this morning that said that he used his presidential powers to pass sort of executive legislation. So anyway. But changing the labour laws in France. And his motivation was that because the labour laws are so stringent, right, they make it so hard to remove people who you've hired, it's very hard for young people in France to get secure employment. Because companies are very nervous about making people permanent employees. So there are lots of young people in France who are on, you know, like fixed-term contracts. And it's like, okay, well, I just don't know after this 6 months if I'm going to have a job anymore. And it's like, that's not the conditions that we wanted to create. That it's like there was a thing that we set out to do by having this legislation, and actually we're starting to achieve completely the opposite thing, right? So it's not really working out for anybody. So the sort of the concept that emerges out of this, which I think is useful, is the idea of role security and person security, right? And I think that this is a really useful concept for us to work with as well. So one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today is how role security versus person security could play out in holacracy and how that could be a good thing. But there's, I think that this is a concept that has a solid heritage. So Craig Larman, who is one of the inventors of LESS, large-scale Scrum, which is another approach to sort of like another operating system for self-managing organizations. When they implement LESS in organizations, this concept of role security and person security is very important to them. They're like, we're going to implement sweeping change in your organization, and we don't want anybody who wants to keep working for the organization to not have work here. So there will be person security, you will continue to be employed, but the nature of this change means that the jobs that you hold now might not exist anymore, or they might be completely restructured, or it might no longer make sense for you to do them, or it might make sense for you to do them but for other people to do them. So there are going to be changes. So we don't offer any role security, but we do offer person security. And I have a lot of respect for Craig, and I think he understands a lot about organizational design, and I think there's a lot of integrity in that concept. So I think it's a good concept for us to work with. But what would it look like in holacracy, right, if we work with this idea of person security rather than role security? How would it be if role assignments could be changed at any time? Should we go there? Yeah, that's better. You know, what would that look like? And it might look a bit like this, right? This is canonically just sort of like, you know, off the shelf in holacracy, how role allocation works. At any moment, I can resign, and I don't need a reason. I can just say, yeah, I'm not doing that role anymore. At any moment, I can be removed from a role, and the lead link doesn't need a reason. Remembering that in off-the-shelf holacracy, the lead link has responsibility over role allocation, but we can always make that into another role that's responsible or make a process responsible. If the lead link wants me to join a role, I can say refuse. I don't think I can say refuse. I think I can say no.
Well, you could say refuse.
Yeah, I can say no, and I don't need a reason. And if I want to join a role, the lead link can only say no if they have a valid objection, i.e. if they can say this would cause some harm to the circle's ability to express its purpose. Now, this is an interesting scenario because who has power here? And it's different to how we have had things set up previously, right? We've previously had restrictions that say, you know, if you want to leave a role, then, you know, if the lead link wants to remove you from a role, then it's a lengthy process and they have to have, you know, clear reasons that they're set out and they have to work with you, like little role security stuff. If you want to leave a role, you have to give 4 weeks notice, etc. And now we're saying, okay, well, how would it be if the lead link could just at any time just remove anybody from a role? Yep, sorry, you're not doing that role anymore. Would that mean that the lead link ends up suddenly with like an unreasonable amount of power? You know, remembering that the flip side of this is, if I want to join a role, the lead link can only say no if they have a valid objection. So when we add all of these rules together, we're saying, you know, yes, in theory, yes, the lead link can remove anybody from a role at a moment's notice without giving a reason. But unless they have a valid objection, i.e. unless they say you being assigned to this role is actually causing harm to the circle, then you can just ask to be added back in and they have to add you back in. So this is, I think it's a very interesting setup, right? There's a balance here. So what happens in this change is that we say, when the lead link has a valid objection, when the lead link sees that a role allocation is causing harm, they can change that role allocation instantly. But you can also change your role allocation instantly, and you don't need a reason. So, what does this add up to? What does this mean? We've talked about valid objections. No, I want to skip that because I feel like I talked about it already a bit, and I want to talk about dynamic steering. So, when Holacracy want to do training around Holacracy, this is one of the concepts that they talk about, and you may remember if you were at the kickoff meeting with Kuhn around about this time last year, or if you've watched any of the videos from that the concept of dynamic steering is one that is like, I don't know, it's kind of, it's like popular in the Holacracy community, let's say. And what does it mean, like dynamic steering? Well, the idea in Holacracy is that at any moment in time, as a partner of the organisation, holding some roles, we are asked to deliver the maximum value that we can at that moment, right? So that's sort of some of what the dynamism is about, right? Rather than say, you know, every day I do this because that's my job, say, right now, what needs doing? From all of the roles that I hold, actually right now is what is the most important thing, right? So it's got that kind of dynamism and change rather than rather than sort of being fixed. Now, if you can give up a role at any time without giving notice, right? You might just say, you know, yeah, I'm looking at these roles and you know, like dynamic steering, right? I'm dynamically prioritizing. I'm looking at them and saying, it just really doesn't make sense for me to hold this role anymore. You know, given the work that I could be doing in the organisation, given that I have a limited amount of time and energy to get stuff done here, holding this role is holding me back from contributing the maximum value that I can to the organisation. So I'm not going to hold it anymore. I'm just going to give it up. And the thing that comes around in this discussion again and again is like, oh yeah, but what about those pieces of work that, you know, are in themselves not very high value or not very interesting, not very engaging, or whatever it is, but that are somehow, you know, necessary for other stuff that is impactful, high value, engaging, etc. Like, what happens there, right? If people can just give up a role at any time, what do we do? And the answer, which, I'm going to come back to a little bit later, or do I have a slide on this? Oh no, I don't have a slide on it. Great, so I'll say it now. And I think the answer is, you have to have a conversation, right? That there is a way of practicing Holacracy. Like I've said it before, right? Holacracy is about the implicit over the explicit. It's designed to bring a lot of stuff to the surface. When it's working well, it brings a lot of stuff to the surface. But I think it becomes possible to practice Holacracy in a way that you don't get the maximum value you can out of it as a system for bringing the important stuff to the surface. And I think as soon as you start to say, oh yeah, well, you know, things like, you know, we'll set things up so that it's easy for people to leave roles that they don't like, what that's doing is you're using the system to bury a conversation with that person that might be uncomfortable, in which you say, I know you don't like doing this work, but it really needs doing. Will you work with me on this, right? As a lead link, right? You're like, this is work that needs doing in this circle. How are we gonna, like, this sort of constant, like, grown-up, open conversations about how we're gonna get stuff done together. So there's a way in which, as an individual, being able to just give up a role at a moment's notice allows you to do more dynamic steering, and it brings up conversations that need to happen about roles that maybe people are keener to leave. It may be also true from the point of view of from the lead link, right? Being able to remove people at any time adds a level of dynamism, and in fact, it adds a level of agility to the organisation. Agility is about being able to turn on a dime for a dime, right? That we can, or on a sixpence for a sixpence, if you prefer. Thinking of the famous turning circle of a black cab turning on a sixpence. How big actually was a sixpence? I have no idea. I don't think I've ever seen one this big. But so agility is about saying, if we suddenly discovered that, tomorrow there was something that we could be doing that was much better for some given value of better than stuff that we're doing today, then we should just be able to do it. No matter how big the change apparently was, we should just be able to do it at a very low cost. That's the aim of being agile as an organisation. And it's like it's a perfection statement, right? It's hard to achieve, but that's like the perfection statement of agility. We should be able to make any change very easily. So, and I say that this is from the point of view of the lead link, but it's not, it's not just from the point of view of the lead link. Because, agility within a circle would mean that we would want to be able to say, let's change the way that we do our work. And if we're going to change the way that we do our work, quite possibly that means we're going to change the role structures that we use. Roles are ways that we encode the work that we have on hand and sort of, the way that we do it, the way that we chop the work up. So if we want to change the way that we do the work, we probably need to change role structure. And changing role structure means, as soon as we're working in a holacracy where we feel a need to have role security rather than person security, there's a blocker on our agility. There's a blocker on our way to restructure work. And I think it's a very powerful blocker because I think it's a very emotional one, right? I think there's a sort of deep-seated emotional thing going on for us here. To sort of to point to this in the plainest possible terms, and we were discussing this earlier, but to point to this in the plainest possible terms, in the going on for 4 years that I have worked here, the way that we deliver tax credit claims has not changed substantially. It's still almost the same as it was 4 years ago. There are a few changes here and there. G2 is much better than the old Guardian. There's no question about that. It's a beautiful system. So there are lots of ways in which we've made small improvements. But in terms of how does the work generally work, it looks very much like it looked 4 years ago. We haven't made any substantial changes to that. And what is it that blocks us from making substantial changes? Because it's not that I would say that everybody says the way that we do this now is perfect. We're completely satisfied with it, And I think part of what blocks us from that is because there's something in this role security idea. There's something in the fact that it's important to me to keep holding the same roles and to know who I am in those roles and to feel that those roles represent my engagement in the organisation, as opposed to a sort of person security model, which is to say, all of my roles could disappear tomorrow, but I know that I still have a job here. I know that I still have a job here. I know that it's not going to impact me negatively. I'm going to be paid the same. I'm going to be respected the same. I'm going to be just as much a member of the organisation, even if all of the roles that I do today disappear and become something else.
Andrew, can I ask a question?
I would rather, yes.
Okay, just a quick one, because you said I'm going to be paid the same, and if we change roles, we should always look at whether we should change our pay. when we change the roles. So just wanted to kind of challenge that. If that's okay, unless you're talking about it later.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of talking about it later, but like in some ways, the fact that our pay system is built so heavily around roles, I think, is tied into the way in which we have like role security built into our culture. Like if I sort of zoom out and sort of step back a bit here from this conversation and say, like, what is the value of this presentation? Like, why am I sharing these ideas with you? What is it that I would like to happen? It's that I want to point to the fact that we have a role security approach right now, and that that's something that shows up in a way that we do a load of stuff, including the way that we do pay. And I want to point to the fact that a person security rather than a role security approach has some quite big advantages, even if it's actually harder to do. And it's not that I think, oh yeah, I've got all the solutions, let's make these changes and then we'll have a person security approach. But it's like, it seems to me that this is an important mind virus, right? This is an important seed to plant with people so that we can start to think, wait, okay, like, what is going on here? What do we want? Does that, so, yeah. So agility is about our ability to change the work, and we have more agility if we're less focused on role security. And there's a sort of like idea that's linked to that, which is succession is no, I don't want to, what do I want to say? Like, people leaving is a fact of life. Ash is a good case in point here, right? Anybody in this organisation could this afternoon say, I've got another job and I'm giving in my notice, which for most people is 4 weeks. For people who've been here longer, it's a little bit longer. I think it's like a week for every 6 months of service. That's what it is in my contract. Maybe other people's contracts is different, but sort of, let's say 4 or 6 weeks-ish is about people's notice period. Anybody could just do that right now. 4 weeks or 6 weeks is not long enough to extract all of the information from the head of somebody who carries lots of important information on behalf of the organisation. Someone who let's imagine someone who's the most knowledgeable person about how to deliver tax credit claims, has been doing it for a long time, knows a lot of stuff that other people don't know, is able to solve sort of issues that other people don't know how to solve because of the depth of their knowledge. We don't have any security over that person's tenure in the organisation. They could give us notice at any time, and their notice period, I would suggest, is not long enough for us to extract from them everything that we need to in order to not suddenly have a knowledge and skills gap. And what that means is we should always be thinking about the fact that when some people know more things than others, when other people have knowledge and skills that we don't have, that we want them to be continually passing it to us, so that we don't have these points of failure in the system. So it isn't the case that somebody is so knowledgeable or so critical that if they left, there would be a massive hole or things would fall apart. And this is robustness, right? This is the ability for us to say, yeah, like, if people can leave the organisation, and we just need to be a bit like, so saying that you can leave a role at any time brings the reality of the fact that you could leave the organisation at any time a little bit closer at hand and gets you thinking about robustness. And then there's this linked concept of anti-fragility, which is invented by the guy who wrote Sapiens, by the way, like nice little sort of trivia fact for you there. But the point is, like, an anti-fragile system is one that gets stronger the more that you negatively impact it. So, like, robust systems are systems that can recover from negative impact. Anti-fragile systems are systems that actually get stronger. So, in some ways, your immune system, is an anti-fragile system in some ways, in the sense that every time that you get ill, your immune system has got slightly stronger, right? Like, you're not going to get ill from that thing again. Like, your immune system learns adaptively, and if you haven't got ill, then your immune system isn't booted up. Like, it doesn't have a library to work from. So maybe having person security rather than role security creates greater robustness. But then sort of alongside the idea of agility and the idea of being able to restructure is like, why would we want to restructure? What will be the purpose of that? And there's this sort of concept of waste, and particularly I want to talk about like necessary waste. You know, here is a possibly controversial thesis. Maybe nothing that I do for the organization is invaluable, right? How would we know? But the point is that, you know, it might turn, so here's a possible idea, like, you know, when I leave, just don't hire to replace me. Because maybe you know, like all of this stuff that I do, like, you know, standing up here, having this presentation now, okay, great, like, is this valuable? Will the organization burn down if this doesn't happen? Will the organization be in any way worse off if this presentation doesn't happen? You know, I fiddle around with, you know, sort of structural stuff and governance a lot. Like, is that important? Does it really do anything for the organization? If somebody stopped doing that, would anybody notice? So there can be ways in which you do things that you care about, that you have made effort to get good about, that you put effort into doing well, and that other people look at and say, that seems important, I'm glad that somebody is doing that, but that you could stop doing and it actually wouldn't make any difference. So detecting waste is, you know, like this is the most painful bit of becoming a more agile organization, is the point at which you discover where waste is and the things that you cared about were actually waste. And the example that, when we were talking about this earlier, but I think is an important one, is like management. Right? Management is a kind of secondary waste. You know, because once you have a self-managing system, you don't need managers, or you don't need managers in the same way, and you certainly don't need so many of them as you do in a pyramid organization where you have these multiple layers of managers. Well, all of those people, you know, some of whom are bad at their jobs and some of whom are good at their jobs, but think about the people who are, you know, managers in pyramid organizations who are really good managers. They've read all of the books, they've been on the trainings, they're, you know, like very grounded, they've got this lovely mature energy that they bring to stuff, they're very open, blah, 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 blah. But then, you know, all organizations become self-managing, and suddenly, instead of needing, you know, like 100 people working and then, you know, like 30 middle management or whatever, I don't know, what would be a good ratio, like, you know, sort of 15 or 16 middle managers. Instead, for 100 people working, you need, you know, 5 coaches and that's it. And it's like, those other 10 people became really good at something that actually it just turned out was waste that was a product of the way the system was currently structured, because that's what agility is about, right? We're trying to continually design out waste from the system. So maybe the idea of person security rather than role security makes it safer for us to go and look for waste and eliminate it. Because if it turns out that work that we cared about, roles that we cared about, got eliminated because in some sense they were waste, we're not left out in the cold, right? We still feel secure in some way. And I'm not pointing to necessarily how we should do person security, but and I think that it is important, if we want to have person security, that we do something, but that, you know, maybe there are some things that we can do. Penultimate slide. Coming back to the idea that, you know, holacracy is a way of bringing some things to the surface more clearly. When, so, you know, we've had our role removal process, the first step of which has been formal feedback. That's sort of been how things have been for a while. And there have been some uses of the formal feedback process that I'm aware of. There may very well be some that I'm not aware of. You know, there's no reason why, you know, yeah, why should I be aware of them? But there are some that I'm aware of because I've been involved in them in some way. And the 2 that I have been involved with, at the heart of both of those issues has been a breakdown in trust between the people on either side, which isn't to say that there wasn't necessarily some actual feedback that needed to be delivered, but the reason why the role removal process had been started, the reason why the formal feedback process had been started was because, yeah, some the sort of the kernel of feedback that needed to be delivered wasn't getting across because of a breakdown in trust. and issues that were small were getting amplified in people's heads because they weren't talking. So there was a sort of like, there was a conflict situation, which is normal, right? That's kind of what it is to be a human being. It happens like that. But what it is to be an emotionally mature, self-managing human being is to have an awareness of the fact that we get into conflicts and to notice that we're getting into conflicts. Like, let's just step back for a second from the idea of self-management and say, like, one of the things that managers do, right, there's necessary waste, but like one of the things that managers do is they detect conflicts in their team. Like, oh, the team isn't working as well as it could have done because, you know, Jill isn't talking to John. Right, well, you know, I'll make sure that, you know, like, I'll go and talk to Jill and find out what the issue is. I'll go and talk to John and find out what the issue is. I'll explain it to both of them. I'll get them to meet and the problem will be solved. And that's me doing a good job as a manager, and everyone goes, oh, he's such a good manager because, you know, like, he really keeps the team working well. And it's true, right? Like, I am doing that. But in a self-managing situation, nobody comes and does that for us. Like, Jill and John have to be their own manager. They have to be their own censor of the fact that they're in conflict, and at some point go, hang on a minute, you know, just hang on a minute here, like, something smells weird here. Like, we've been having these interactions recently on this project, and something isn't adding up. Do you think that we could be in some kind of conflict here? You know? Oh, maybe we are. What should we do? You know, let's phone the conflict resolution support helpline and, you know, and have a facilitated meeting, because for some reason it just turns out that this is magical, right? You have another person in the room and they, you know, they sort of facilitate some stuff for you, and then suddenly, you know, like, you can just sort of cut a swathe through, you're like, oh wait, all of that was bullshit and what we really needed to talk about was this, great. But you know, you sort of have to do that for yourself. So there have been many instances where our existing role removal process has actually been a way that conflict is showing up, and we've said, yes, you're not allowed to remove them from the role because first you have to solve the conflict. And it's like, okay, what happens if we take away that? And we say, actually, you can remove someone from a role at any time, or you can resign from a role at any time. So either resigning or removing, breaking the role allocation, either way, might be a sign of conflict. And I think it just means that it just places greater responsibility on us, because at the moment it's like you say, oh, you know, I've started this role removal process, but I have to defer to dismissals, which is like effectively Daniel, right? But there are other people. But it's sort of like I have to defer to Daniel to, you know, tell me whether or not.
Two of the other people are here. Actually, three of the other people.
Okay, but you're the lead link of the circle. So from the outside of the circle, if we talk to dismissals, we're talking to you. Yeah, like that is how holacracy works. You know, it's like I can say finance and I can mean, you know, like I can go and talk to Nikki and I can say, I'm talking to you as finance. You know, great, because finance is a black box to me. Or I can choose for it to be a black box to me and just take it to be a role held by one person. And in that sense, a role called dismissals is held by Daniel. It's a role in the GCC. He chooses to break that down into some other work in a circle, but anyway. But you know, you say, okay, yeah, you're not actually allowed to move forward with the role removal process until you've solved this conflict. But it's like somebody else is holding the parameters of that for you. And then suddenly we're saying, no one is going to put those training wheels on for you. Like, if you find that there's a role assignment, removal or resignation, I was going to say resignation, that actually your sensors tell you, well, hey, this actually might be a sign of a breakdown in trust. Like, actually what might be needed here is some candor that's been missing, right? Going all the way back to talks that we did last year about trust and vulnerability, when we get ourselves into conflict, what's happening is there's a lack of candor. There's a thing that isn't being said. Like, there's something that we're not being really open about. There's a way in which we're not being vulnerable. And conflict is this invitation to say, let's get vulnerable about that thing. Like, let's get to what really matters in this situation. And we have to take responsibility for that. We have to take responsibility for noticing, you know, I or you resigned from that role or removed from that role. And I actually don't think that it was motivated by, you know, trying to achieve robustness or trying to achieve, you know, reduction of waste, agility, or like anything like that. I think it was motivated by a breakdown in trust between the two of us, and I think that we should talk about that. Like, you kind of have to notice it. You know, because you could get into a tit-for-tat situation where you could say, well, look, here is a role that is business critical that somebody does, and I'm the only person that's assigned to it, but you're my lead link, and we have a breakdown in trust, And as a consequence of that breakdown in trust, which you're totally submersed in, right? Because that's how conflict works. We get totally sort of submersed in it. You're absolutely convinced that I am doing a terrible job and I must be removed from this role, and therefore you exercise your power to remove this role, and now no one is doing this business critical piece of work. What do we do? And I say to you, will you add me back to this piece of work? It's very important that somebody does it, and I think I'm the most qualified person. And you say no, and you supply some reason, which the other person maybe thinks is spurious, but you supply some reason from that seems really true from your point of view. And so, having been removed from the role, I could say, well, somebody needs to be in this. Okay, well, I can skip round you and go and talk to your lead link and say, this lead link isn't doing their job because they removed me from this role, and their so-called valid reason doesn't seem valid from my point of view, so I don't believe they're doing their job properly. And this lead link could say, okay, well, I'll remove them from that role, and then I'll step in here, and then I'll add you right there. And, this could go on forever, right? We can play this game endlessly. And what is this game saying to us? This game is saying, why the fuck are you playing this stupid game? Why aren't you getting on with your work? And it's like, oh, wait a second. Rather than doing the thing that matters and getting on with our work, we've got locked into playing a foolish game. Could it be that we might be in conflict and that's why this is happening? Like we're doing this sort of tit-for-tat stuff because there's a conversation that we're avoiding. And, the tit-for-tat stuff is all totally legitimate. Go right ahead and do that anyway. But at some point, maybe things are going to point out to you, wait, actually, yeah, there's something that I should be doing here as well. So I think there are some reasons why having this sort of person security approach, making it easier to join and leave roles, is a good thing. But are there ways that it might be a bad thing? Well, we touched on this a bit earlier with Pau's question, which is pay. And I also want to talk a little bit about sort of motivation, right? Which is a very good point that Rowan made. Which is, our pay system is tied to roles. How pay works in the outside world is sort of tied to roles. And our pay system, which, our pay system is built around benchmarking. So what do we do? Like, what do we, and I don't know. I genuinely don't know what we do about this. What I will say is, going back to thinking about sort of Craig Larman and the work that they do with less, that, Craig Larman is the guy who came up with the phrase, culture follows structure, which, I love that phrase. And he's like, except in small organisations where actually it's the other way around, maybe we're sort of on the, teetering on the brink of, not being a small organisation. And so one of the points that he makes is, and we've talked, so a lot of the stuff that I've talked about here is kind of relevant in, in implementing less, much as I think it's also relevant in implementing holacracy. He's like, if your compensation system rewards people for becoming managers, then what are people going to do? They're going to work to develop the skills to become managers. But if what you want is self-managing teams, you don't want to reward people to become managers because you don't need managers. What you want to reward people to do is to become more and more effective members of self-managing teams. And in less, which is like an application of Scrum, and therefore is genuinely like it's sort of built on the assumption that you're a software development organization, what it means to be a more effective self-managing team and what it means to be a better contributor there is to be a more multi-skilled programmer. Like in a self-managing feature team, in a team that is able to, without going out and getting resources from anywhere else in the business, able to deliver potentially shippable product increments to actually, be updating stuff in a way that we can send it out, right? You want people who can do the whole gamut of programming skills, like right the way through even to things like sort of graphic design and video editing for the, sort of user front end, right? So his point is that if that's what you want, if you want effective self-managing teams, you need to move away from a compensation system that rewards people for becoming managers and one that rewards people for becoming more multi-skilled individual contributors as part of a self-managing team. So that actually what you do is you say, if you know fluently if you know to some agreed standard one programming language, this is this pay band. If you know 3, it's this pay band. If it's 5, it's this pay band. If it's 7, it's this pay band. So that you like you motivate people to go out and learn more skills. This looks a little bit like the badge-based system that Holacracy One had for a while as their pay model, which they've actually now stopped using for whatever reason. Where you reward people on a skill basis. You're like, oh, you know, here are the skills that you bring to the organisation, and you know the number of skills that you have add up to your total pay package. It's, you know, so there are ways of doing pay that get away from job identity and role identity. That doesn't mean that they're good or effective ways of doing pay, and you know maybe we can't resolve this, but it's like, as long as we pay people on the basis of role identity, quite reasonably we're all going to want role security, because we don't want to think that a decision damages our pay. So there's something about that. And then the other thing is, you know, motivation. Like, that if there's a role that you really care about, that you really enjoy doing, you could be taken out of that role at any minute. What would be the impact on you, and what would be the impact on the organisation of you being taken out of the role that you most care about? I mean, you know, even if it turns out actually, you know, that role is being removed because we don't think that it does anything. You know, like we think that it's, you know, like maybe some of the stuff that I do or whatever, or like management, you know, like it's sort of, we like it, but actually it turns out that if we take it away, nothing falls apart. Might there be something that we have to say? Yeah, actually, you know, like that impact on people's motivation is an issue, and I don't know if there's a way around this. You know, maybe a way around it is that it's about conversations again. It's about saying, you know, you've taken me away from that role, and that's actually the role that I most care about. You know, like people have to be responsible for saying, you know, this impacts my motivation, and so I want it to change, rather than the sort of more like, you know, like sort of managed philosophy, which is like individual people's motivations has to be looked after by somebody else who has to sort of know about them. I don't know. You know, it's kind of an open question for me. So look, role security versus person security. Some thoughts about that issue. I would love to hear people's comments and questions and speeches and.
I find the idea of what you said, the skills-based pay, interesting. I feel like we've been through that. I think we've had discussions about this before. When we thought, what if, let's say I decided to quit my software development role and decides to become a tea girl, a tea woman, tea boy, whatever that is. I will make tea. But I'm going to be paid the same based on my skills. Yeah, so I would still be paid the same. I think that's what, like, kind of one of the reasons why we've gone with basing it on roles rather than because with roles you can kind of see the impact of the role, whereas with skills it doesn't necessarily translate. Just as someone with 3 degrees might be a shittier programmer than someone who has 0 degrees and just been programming a lot. So yeah, it's just a thought about like sort of what might not, like one reason why that just doesn't,
like a sort of skill or badge-based approach. You know, I'm not saying that that's sort of right for us.
Right.
And you're right that there are also ways in which it's like, oh well, if I'm no longer using those skills that I was being paid for, like, and I've shifted over here, like, are we just shifting the same problem of, like, you know, like, are we creating like a skill security issue? You know, which means that I want to have role security because I want to be able to be sure that I can keep using these skills that I have that are most valuable. Like, yeah, I don't have an answer for that right now.
I kind of do.
I have a reflection as well on this. Just to look at the other side of the coin, to what you said, Greenie, it's almost like, you know, a part of me that really believes in human potential and in the hunger to do the best and give the best of what we have. So, like, to a degree, I believe that there's a natural urge, like, in us, if you have some core skills, to actually deploy them. And I'm not saying that that means you should have skills-based pay straight away. I'm just saying that I believe that if we really trust people, then we also trust them that they want to give the best of themselves and seek opportunities and ways of doing things that will not only get them to use the skills that they have, but like develop new skills. Just a thought.
I kind of want to add like what I have been saying already in the GTF Open and in various other contexts, which is that I think there's the piece missing there is, okay, there's the skills that you have, your capacity, and we used to have a pay system that rewarded based on your capacity. The original bucket system was like what you have the capacity to do, and as Paulina points out, it was basically making the assumption that if you're in the D bucket, you're going to bring your D bucket capacity to whatever role you're doing, and so assume that you're going to add value to that level. And then we kind of moved to the completely other end of the scale. We said, okay, well, what's the role, the benchmark of the roles that you hold, and how much are they paid, and so on. And that's still missing the piece which is in the middle, which is what work do you actually do? What impact do you actually have on the business? And that's kind of a multiplication of your competence, the person you are, the capacity that you bring, and the invitations that the roles present to actually do useful work in the business. And I see that in that context, making sure that those invitations are dynamic and adjust to the needs of the organization actually probably helps people to maximize the work. Now, how do we then map, like track that work and so on? That's an interesting challenge. How do we track the impact of that work, the value added by that work? That's an even more interesting and as in even more difficult challenge. But it feels to me that it's in that middle piece that the pay question gets resolved. It's like, you know, once we actually like forget about, like not forget, but use the roles that you hold as a piece of information, use your competencies as a piece of information, but like find what is the intersection between those two, what you actually do with those things, what impact have you actually had? That's what we pay for, or that's what we should be paying for, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting, although it opens up the risk of saying, well, then your value, the added value that you produce on your line of work. So it's about the results. If you know, if the skills are not really what we pay you for, but on the work that you carry out, and how do you value the work of an office manager? How do you value the? I mean, it's again, it's a usual, it's a cycle. It's fun. I don't have the answer, but it's a usual conversation. People who are closer to sales, people who are closer to producing value, that can go on a budget, on a spreadsheet. That's easy. What about everybody else? And I kind of thought about this. Actually, I was thinking about this yesterday because working on the new digital content producer role, which is a mix of copywriting and video production and design at different levels. What kind of salary? So we wanted to have someone do this internally. Would we get them? Ideally, someone able to carry out 10 different job roles, but maybe all other kind of not mid-entry, but let's say similar kind of, not junior role or level, but they can carry out 10. So how do you, are we gonna say, well, yeah, but you're still gonna carry out junior work on a full-time basis, so yeah, your salary should be in this range. And that person can say, well, but I picked up so many skills, shouldn't that be rewarded in some way? Because otherwise we're not self-managing, but we still rely on the traditional job market. I was thinking about this yesterday as well, about my self-review, and I was like, well, I wish I could benchmark my role against a database of open culture companies that have open culture and self-management job role, so it could be a little bit more adherent to what we actually do. Because there are things that, if you don't have that, then you're gonna have to rely include so many things that we don't do, so many things that a company who's looking for something different will do. I mean, it's a fascinating topic. I think it's there's a lot to uncover here, but I don't know how I will do that. Sorry, that was really not helpful at all.
Sort of like on the same topic, more or less, like sort of picking up on this theme. You know, like what Daniel was saying about it's the value that you actually deliver that you want to be rewarded on, right? There's maybe something about sort of dynamic steering, which to steer dynamically effectively, it needs to be clear to you what constitutes adding value, like the mechanism by which you can determine whether or not, if that's what it is to be self-managing, then we say, yeah, you steer yourself dynamically to add the most value that you can. Well, there needs to be a way that you can see for yourself, like what actually adds value or not, so that you can really make that decision. And maybe once you start saying to people, yeah, you can, you know, like leave a role at any time. Okay, this role doesn't seem valuable, I've left it. Oh, wait, that role is super valuable. Oh, okay, well, doesn't appear at all valuable to me, so please do some work to make it clear how this role is valuable, you know? It's like it brings to the surface the need to say, yeah, maybe actually building mechanisms to show people what is valuable is important, and maybe it's more important than, like, I don't know, something else that I might do, like holiday policy or whatever.
I mean, kind of like slightly dystopian, possibly utopian or dystopian. It's difficult to tell right off the bat. But vision of what something like that might look like is that, for example, for each role or sub-circle or whatever, you assign a value that, like if you're a budget holder, you assign a value that you think you're willing to spend on that, and then some criteria of how you know the role has been met, and then that creates this kind of clear frame around every single role, and that would then resolve a lot of the, I mean, that would be an answer to a lot of the how much should I be paid thing, because it would be a sum of the roles, but then you'd be like, that only works if A, the budget holders do that, and B, if the criteria for actually meeting each role's accountabilities are really clear, so that, you know, it's not just, well, I've been in this role for 3, although, yeah, I mean, you'd want the criteria to be clear before you join the role, because otherwise, I guess, the budget holder or the lead link could just remove you from that role. I don't know, there's some kind of system there that could emerge, but it sounds potentially dystopian in my head right now. Sorry, just thinking out loud.
Another thought that I had, which I forgot earlier, was the idea of yes, which I think was what I meant by the slide that I skipped over. I had the slide that said valid objection, and I was like, oh, I don't want to do this. And I remember what I meant by that. I should have called it something else. I should have called it safe to try, because that's what I really wanted to say. Which is, you know, there's this thing, you know, that you can see on the governance cards, which is, you know, do you know that this will have this impact? Do you know that this harm will occur? Or is this action safe to try, knowing that it can be revisited at any time? And there's something about a person security model, like your tenure in the organization is not at risk, but when it's hard for you to leave roles and when it's hard for you to be removed from roles, then both for you and for the lead link, assigning you to the role becomes slightly less safe to try. It's because it's no longer something that can be revisited at any time. Like, are you willing to take on this role knowing that you could resign it at any time? I mean, bearing in mind that even if you take on a role, you don't actually have to then do anything in that role, right? There's no way in Holacracy to compel people to do things.
I want to make a comment about that.
Yeah.
I was reading an article, and that goes back to your slide about anti-fragility.
Yeah.
And the article was talking about how companies like Amazon, for example, is very anti-fragile, but a lot of it is a result of having fragility on the people level. So what that means is that they can let go of people really easily. They don't exactly treat their employees very well, but then they're able to create an anti-fragile company because they're able to just let go and hire people as they wish.
Interesting.
We don't want to be that kind of company, obviously. So there is a need for us to introduce some sort of fragility in, say, on a role level that allows us to make those changes in order to make the company more anti-fragile. Anyway, I just think that article was a really, really good article about just kind of like industry, like fragility, companies, anti-fragility, that like sort of like breaking down onto different level. And what I'm hearing from you is that we need to kind of make roles more fragile in order to kind of sustain this like anti-fragile company.
Yeah.
I think the counterparts to what that article is suggesting is that at the same time we want to make partner protection stronger. So rather than saying, oh, we're going to make roles more fragile, fuck the people. We're saying we're going to make roles more fragile, but we still care about people's sense of safety and security here.
Right.
So we're going to go and make the partner protection more robust as a counterpoint to doing this.
Anyway, thank you. Thanks everyone for your comments. 2 o'clock. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers.
Andrew,
Yeah.
can I